What if two of the most powerful drug lords in history weren't in Colombia or Mexico, but deep in the jungles of Southeast Asia? One commanded an army and declared himself a freedom fighter. The other built a billion-dollar business empire from the shadows. This is the untold story of Khun Sa and Lo Hsing Han, two men who didn't just flood the world with heroin, they rewrote the rules of global crime. One ruled with rifles, the other with contracts, and both proved that in the Golden Triangle, power isn't always loud, it's just unstoppable. In the rugged highlands of eastern Myanmar, where the borders of Thailand, Laos, and China blur into the shadows of the opium trade, two names once defined the balance of power, Khun Sa and Lo Hsing Han. To outsiders, they were drug lords. To their communities, they were something more. Warlords, businessmen, sometimes even heroes. But beyond the myths, their empires were built on heroin, blood, and strategy. Khun Sa was born Zhang Qifu in 1934 into a Chinese Shan family in the hills near Loi Moor. Orphaned early, he joined nationalist militias as a teenager and soon realized that guns weren't just for politics, they were for control. By the 1970s, Khun Sa commanded an army of over 10,000 men, the Shan United Army, operating openly in Myanmar's Shan state. At his peak in the 1980s, U.S. authorities estimated he controlled 50 to 70% of the world's heroin supply, shipping hundreds of tons through the infamous Golden Triangle. His troops guarded poppy fields, processed morphine, and moved heroin across the Thai border into a global distribution network that reached New York, Berlin, and Sydney. Meanwhile, Lo Hsing Han played a longer game. Born in 1935 in the Kokang region, he rose to prominence during the Cold War as a broker between warlords and the military junta. Convicted of heroin trafficking in 1973, he was sentenced to death, but the government later commuted his sentence and released him, seeing value in his ability to navigate between power centers. He rebuilt his empire not through guns, but through deals. By the 1990s, Lo had founded Asia World, a conglomerate that would become one of Myanmar's largest construction and logistics companies, funded in part, according to U.S. Treasury investigations, by heroin profits laundered through infrastructure projects. Both men earned attention from the DEA. Khun Sa was placed on the U.S. Most Wanted list with a $2 million bounty on his head, the highest ever offered at the time for a non-American trafficker. Lo, in contrast, kept his name out of headlines, but not out of government files. In 2008, both he and his son, Stephen Law, were sanctioned by the U.S. government for using their corporate empire to launder drug money and finance criminal networks. And yet, neither man fit the typical mold. Khun Sa called himself a revolutionary, declaring his heroin trade a means to fund Shan independence. Lo never made such claims. He preferred influence over ideology. Where Khun Sa waged war, Lo made investments. One vanished into exile, the other left behind an empire that outlived him. This is not just a story about drugs. It's about two men who shaped a region, influenced international law enforcement strategy, and revealed how power moves in the shadows, sometimes with bullets, sometimes with business cards. Khun Sa and Lo Hsing Han built their empires in the same territory, but they operated in opposite ways. Their methods weren't just tactics, they reflected how each man saw the world, what he wanted from it, and how far he was willing to go to get it. For Khun Sa, heroin wasn't just business, it was war funding. He believed that the Shan people, his ethnic group, had been ignored, abused, and marginalized by the central Burmese government. So, in the 1970s, He turned his armed group into a self-declared liberation movement. His soldiers protected opium fields. His lieutenants ran processing labs. He established trade routes with militias in Thailand, and over time, his army controlled entire valleys of poppy cultivation. Reports from DEA agents in the late 80s estimated that Khun Sa's network moved over 1,000 tons of raw opium annually, much of it converted into high-purity heroin and smuggled abroad. This wasn't a side hustle, it was a state-sized operation. Khun Sa saw himself as a revolutionary, but his politics were pragmatic. He used nationalism as leverage, offering to stop all heroin production if the US funded his independence movement. They refused. He kept exporting. He sat for interviews with journalists, framed himself as a necessary evil, even as addicts died from his product in cities he would never see. His logic was cold. If there's demand, there will be supply. If not him, then someone else. And if war was going to be fought anyway, better it serve his cause. Lo Hsing Han's approach was quieter but no less deliberate. After his release from prison in the 1980s, he didn't rebuild his drug routes through violence. He rebuilt through bureaucracy. He moved from the jungle into boardrooms, forming partnerships with generals, using business licenses and construction permits instead of AK-47s. With his son, Stephen Law, he founded Asia World, a company that won major infrastructure contracts, including the construction of Yangon's deep-sea port and major highways. These weren't fronts, they were real projects, but beneath them, investigators allege, lay a complex financial web of shell companies and offshore accounts used to wash narcotics money clean. Unlike Khun Sa, Lo never made grand statements. He didn't claim to fight for a people or challenge the state. In fact, he became part of it. His strength was subtlety. While Khun Sa's soldiers marched, Lo's influence seeped through systems, building power not by force, but by alignment. He understood the one thing Khun Sa never accepted. In a corrupt structure, the most secure position isn't outside the system, it's inside it. Psychologically, they were studies in contrast. Khun Sa was charismatic, combative, a man who enjoyed power in the open. Lo was calculated, quiet, almost invisible in public. One was drawn to risk, the other to control. Both, however, shared one core trait: detachment. Neither man showed remorse for the human cost of their trade. Whether under the flag of revolution or corporate growth, they treated heroin as a tool, and people as collateral. Their motives may have diverged, but their results converged. Both men destabilized societies, corrupted institutions, and turned a regional trade into a global threat. One with a rifle, one with a pen, both with absolute conviction. To measure the threat posed by Khun Sa and Lo Hsing Han, it isn't enough to count the kilograms of heroin they moved or the bribes they paid. The real danger was how deeply each man penetrated the systems meant to stop him. Law enforcement agencies across the globe saw them not just as traffickers, but as architects of corruption, instability, and impunity. Their operations exposed how weak borders were, how easily laws bent under money or fear, and how organized crime could mimic the structure of a functioning state. Khun Sa's threat was immediate, visible, and territorial. His army wasn't symbolic. It was a real force, armed, uniformed, and capable of holding ground against the Myanmar military. By the late 1980s, his forces controlled more than 60% of Shan State's poppy-growing regions. DEA reports from that era confirmed that Khun Sa's heroin was flooding Southeast Asia and increasingly showing up in American cities. In 1989 alone, U.S. Customs intercepted over 900 kilograms of heroin traced back to his networks. His operation was industrial, but what made him truly dangerous was his political ambition. He offered to sell out his rivals to the US in exchange for recognition of an independent Shan state. When rejected, he doubled production and made a public show of defiance, inviting reporters to film his troops in training. This wasn't just a drug war, it was a declaration of sovereignty fueled by narcotics. Lo Hsing Han's threat was slower, quieter, and more insidious. He didn't control territory with weapons. He controlled it through contracts, concessions, and the trust of generals. When Myanmar began opening up its economy in the 1990s, Lo positioned Asia World to capture the lion's share of foreign investment projects. These weren't petty schemes. The company oversaw billion-dollar infrastructure builds, including airports and ports. According to a 2007 report by the US Treasury, Asia World was used to launder proceeds from narcotics trafficking through joint ventures with foreign investors and state officials. That's what made Lo's network harder to dismantle. There were no heroin labs to bomb, no jungle camps to raid, just spreadsheets, offshore accounts, and signed government contracts. Khun Sa terrified the state. Lo blurred into it. One threatened national unity, the other became part of national development. Both proved immune to traditional enforcement tactics. Arrest warrants meant nothing when entire regions refused to comply, or when high-level protection shielded operations from within. Comparing their danger isn't just about scale, it's about shape. Khun Sa's empire crumbled when he surrendered in 1996. His militia dissolved. His influence faded. Lo, in contrast, died in 2013 after a long illness, never having spent another day in prison. His son, Stephen Lo, continues to operate Asia World, despite ongoing US sanctions. That's the difference. Khun Sa's fall ended with him. Lo's machine kept running. From a global crime perspective, Khun Sa was explosive. His heroin helped shape drug markets, and his example inspired a generation of armed traffickers. But Lo Hsing Han represented the evolution of the trade. From warlords to businessmen, from jungle labs to financial networks that cross borders without leaving footprints. Law enforcement can arrest men, but dismantling a structure like Lo's requires international will, political risk, and forensic precision few governments are willing to pursue. Both men left legacies that outlived them, but one left smoke and ash, the other a system still in motion. Khun Sa died in 2007, quietly, in a Yangon villa far removed from the rugged hills where his empire was born. He had surrendered to the government more than a decade earlier, trading his army and influence for immunity and a life of obscurity. There was no trial, no prison sentence, just a quiet retreat into comfort, a former warlord transformed, at least in public, into a retired businessman. For a man who once supplied over half the world's heroin, his exit was anticlimactic. But in a way, that's what made it so chilling. His name faded, but the damage he helped engineer remained. Entire villages addicted, lawless zones carved into the map, and a global trade still haunted by his model. Lo Hsing Han's end was even more calculated. He passed away in 2013, honored with a state-sanctioned funeral. By then, his business interests had become so embedded in Myanmar's economic growth that the lines between crime and nation-building had blurred entirely. Asia World, now run by his son, continued to receive government contracts and international attention, even as it remained under US sanctions for money laundering and connections to narcotics trafficking. There were no public accusations, no courtroom cross-examinations, just quiet nods from those in power, and an unspoken understanding that some structures grow too entangled to be uprooted without shaking the whole tree. Their legacies are not equal in form, but equally enduring in effect. Khun Sa left behind a blueprint for how armed groups could fund themselves through drugs, cloaked in the language of revolution. His model would influence militias across Southeast Asia and beyond. Lo Hsing Han, on the other hand, left behind something more dangerous: the normalization of criminal capital in national development. He showed that with the right alliances, illicit wealth could be legitimized, not by hiding, but by integrating into the very system that should reject it. Their stories are not just cautionary tales. They are warnings. Warnings about what happens when enforcement fails, when corruption protects, and when crime adapts faster than law. The world knew Khun Sa as a rebel king of the Golden Triangle. It knew Lo Hsing Han as a tycoon with a tainted past. But in truth, both were reflections of what happens when geography, conflict, and profit collide in a space beyond accountability. Today, the heroin fields haven't vanished. They've shifted. New names now control the routes. New chemicals have entered the market. Synthetics more addictive, more portable, harder to trace. But the shadow of Khun Sa's militancy and Lo Hsing Han's legitimacy still stretches over them. Their methods live on, not in headlines, but in patterns of behavior, in political structures, in the silence of systems that have learned to benefit from looking away. This isn't just history, it's a map, a way of understanding how criminal empires endure, not through chaos, but through design. Let me know if you'd like a full edit of all 4 parts into one continuous final version. 2 men. One built an empire with bullets, the other with briefcases. Both left behind more than just heroin. They left behind systems that still shape crime today. If this story made you see the drug trade differently, hit like and subscribe for more deep dives into the dark truths behind global power. Now here's the question. Who was more dangerous? Khun Sa, the warlord with an army, or Lo Hsing Han, the businessman who never fired a shot? Let us know in the comments.